It's a great delight to welcome you here to the One Boat today, Margaret. And recently you got an OBE, is that correct, for the work that you've been doing with widows over the years?
That's right.
Well, you know, our congratulations, and it was so well deserved. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you've been doing around widows, and why the plight of widows is so important for you?
Well, let me say, Carrie, it's a great honour to be talking to you. Absolutely wonderful to see you again. And I think it is 15 years since we've met. Mm. And how did I get in to this most neglected of all gender and human rights issues, which is widowhood? I got into it, Carrie. Although I'd been working on women's human rights for many years, I'd been head of law and policy at International Planned Parenthood, which got me all over the world talking about what was happening to women, the status of women. I've been an immigration and asylum lawyer, also looking at what was happening to women who were claiming asylum. I'd never thought about widows. And then my husband died. He died over 30 years ago. And at the time that he was dying and died, I was teaching a course of judicial administration to Commonwealth magistrates. And one of the magistrates from Malawi had a very, very sick baby. They were magistrates, not rich, well-off judges. He couldn't afford South Africa and he couldn't afford Great Ormond Street. But fortunately, my Dorset cottage, my neighbour was the head paediatrician in the hospital at Salisbury, and he offered to take the mother and baby into his hospital. And so we got together and we got her a visa, and she came, first of all, to London. And she walked into my living room, Carrie, and with the baby, and before she even sat down, she said, "You mean your husband's brothers let you stay here and keep all these things?" And that was really the beginning, because I was about to go to teach a course on law, women and development and health at the School of Public Health in the University of Los Angeles, UCLA in LA. And that question, it just was in my mind as I flew across the pond and to to LA. And then I discovered that there was absolutely nothing that you could find out about widows, except, of course, Sooty, which is very rare now. I think the last one was 1958, but Sooty in India and something about Christian missionaries in Africa. Otherwise, nothing. And that was 1993, coming up to the Fourth World Conference for Women that was held in Beijing. And I began to work from 1993 onwards, with nobody talking about widows at all. And I hosted the very first international working group at the Beijing World Conference. And that was the beginning of finding out more and more and more about the appalling plight of uncounted millions of widows, particularly in Africa and South Asia, but in other countries and regions as well.
Okay, so
whose lives were determined not by any modern laws or international standards, but by very patriarchal, discriminatory interpretations of religion, tradition, and custom.
Okay, so Margaret, here we are. You've been recently widowed back in 1990, something like that.
That's right.
And up comes the 1995 really agenda shifting fourth conference, the Beijing conference, at which Hillary Clinton attended, right, in China, to say that human rights were women's as well, which was seen at that time a very brave and breakthrough. I mean, how that tells us something, doesn't it? 1995, and for the president's wife, you know, to stand of the US to stand up and have a statement like that, then received with such wow, what a breakthrough comment, is extraordinary. At the same time, you're coming across, because you're in that personal situation of being a widow yourself, people who are also widows in other locations, and you can see the difference that there is. What happens next?
Well, the next thing that happens is that because we have the Beijing Platform for Action, which has got, I think, all these articles on everything to do with women's rights, education, health, poverty, conflict, the girl, child, institutional mechanisms, violence against women. And that's our sort of key document that we try to hold on to, that language even now, as we're going in the beginning of next week to the Commission on the Status of Women. We're all having to fight like mad to keep even the language which was agreed, extraordinary document that was agreed at that Fourth World Women's Conference 26 years ago. But in that document,
it's why we hold on. It's why we hold on to it. It's why we say, but Beijing.
But we haven't gone forward. We're trying to not go backwards. And maybe later on in this conversation, I will tell you my extreme distress that we are threatened with going backwards. And I'm talking to you in London just the day after we've heard the appalling fate of Sarah Everard, one of all these women who get victims of violence in this country. But the violence, and particularly in the context of conflict, and now with COVID-19, the violence against women is increasing almost every day. And yet we have all these laws and all these international standards. And I'm interested, Carrie, that you mentioned Hillary Clinton being in Beijing, because after that, and at the CSW, when she used to speak, she'd say, oh, isn't it wonderful? Nigeria's now got all these laws about women able to own land. Widows now will be able to own land. Isn't it wonderful? She said about the laws. But of course, it's not so wonderful. It's a way that states sort of window dress and can look as if they really are doing a lot because they've got all these laws, they're passing laws. India's got more laws on the violence against women than any other country in the world. But the violence against women is almost endemic. The point is, you can have laws, but how do you enforce them? Well, how do women know about their rights? Absolutely. How can they dare even go outside their family? The point is that widows suffer more than, I think, any other subsect of women, because they're often quite outside even the paper protection of the laws, because what dominates their lives, particularly in Africa and South Asia, parts of the Middle East, other countries, even indigenous widows in parts of Latin America, are custom and tradition. And as I began to research, and my first book was called A World of Widows, and I dedicated it to my husband. I said, to my dearest Robert, without whose death this book would never have been written.
Oh my goodness, yes.
But I wrote it, and nothing, I've written quite a lot, but nothing has changed. And now, Carrie, I'm even more desperate to get recognition of this issue, because it is not, one thing, I have to dispel the myth that widows are elderly women looked after and respected by their families, because they're not. Even when they're grandmothers, they can be stoned to death as witches in some countries. But widows are of all ages. Exactly. There are many, many child widows. You can be married when you're 3 years old or 12 years old, and you're often married to much older men. So you become a child widow. And also, I have to say now, more than ever, where conflicts, all these conflicts, we said at Nuremberg, and I remember Nuremberg, because remember, I'm born in 1932. I
Wow.
remember it, and I have Jewish parents, so I remember everything that happened. And we said at Nuremberg and afterwards, never, never again, about the Holocaust. And yet we're living now in a world where there are many, many genocides going on. I think you'd rather I didn't mention the countries, but you'll know the countries that I'm talking about,
yes,
which are both racist and misogynist. And rape is now a weapon of war, or terrorism, whatever it is. You separate the men and boys from the women and girls, and you kill or abduct or disappear the men and boys, and you rape the women and girls, you take them into sexual slavery. So in the last few years, I'm not just talking, Carrie, about widows of all ages.
okay.
I'm talking about what we call half widows. And the half widows are the women who are the wives of men who've been abducted, disappeared, forcibly abducted. They're missing men. And they don't even know whether they're widows or not.
No.
Are there men in mass graves somewhere, or are they in prison? Where are they?
And without that clarity, Margaret, where do some of these women sit within their communities?
Well, the problem is, again, it's not every country, but particularly in South Asia and Africa, which are the regions I know very, very well, widows are almost, they're not even, once you're widowed, your very status is demonized. You know, it's a very interesting way that the very vernacular words for widow in many communities, it's harlot, witch, sorceress, prostitute. In fact, our very, very good partner in Nepal on widows refuses to use the word widow because in the vernacular, it has such a terrible meaning. And so she calls it the single women's group. And whenever I've been in Nepal, I say to her, to misquote Shakespeare, a widow under any other name will smell as foul. You've got to use the word widow and get respect for it. But it does show in that vernacular how widows are really seen as the evil eye, and therefore, and they can be treated like chattels. And often widows are subject, and this is a really taboo subject, widows in Africa and in South Asia maybe are subject to the most appalling mourning and burial rites. I don't know if you want me to go into detail, but you probably know, but that is a violence and there's a taboo. It's a silence about that.
Some of those areas, you know, I mean, if people want to find out more and dig a little bit deeper about just what goes on, where do they go to first? Do they go to your book, Margaret?
They can go to my book and they can go to our website. And also on March the 17th, which is next Wednesday, we are actually launching at the CSW at a parallel event, an extraordinary dossier that we have worked on for the last 2 years, showing all the acts of discrimination against widows with actual dates and names and facts for the CEDAW. Carrie, what I really want to say here, and I've only come to this maybe in the last 10 years, that widowhood issues, the poverty of widows is such that it's one of the key drivers of taking girls out of school into early marriage and often FGM, which precedes it, because they can't afford, they have nothing. They're not allowed to own land. They often have no rights to inheritance. When they're widowed, they're either kicked out or they're kept in. They can be inherited by a brother or a husband's cousin, or they're actually thrown out with absolutely nothing. And in their poverty, if they have to choose who to keep at school, who do they keep?
Well, it will be the boys.
The daughter or the son.
Yes.
They take the daughter out and they're forced to give her in early marriage. But what I really want to say, and let me say it, otherwise I'll forget it.
Okay.
It's not a fringe women's issue on
No.
the edge.
No,
It's
no.
absolutely central.
Yeah, yeah.
Because widowhood and its poverty and marginalization and the impact it has on their children is a root cause of expanding and extending poverty right down across the generations, causing that appalling inequality and justified resentment that actually also fuels future instability and conflict. So it's terribly dangerous. And actually, young people in every country are the most valuable resource that a country can have. They're more valuable than diamonds or oil or copper or metals, aren't they? The children. And if you actually have a country where you have so many children who, because their mothers were widowed, never went to school, what are their futures? If they're girls that are put into early marriage, they're having babies before their bodies are even barely past puberty. Yeah. They die in childbirth. Their children are poor and die. The boys maybe, well, they can't get a job. They have no education. Also, most of the unaccompanied child migrants, they're out there alone because their mothers are widowed and they were the ones that were sent to try and.
But what we're talking about here is the fracturing of this, of the social network, the fracturing of, you know, the cocoon of care that you know, we work for so hard, really, in our imaginaries anyway, to create for society. Society is intergenerational, and you know, there should be no one left behind, right? So
and they keep saying no one left behind. Exactly. And I'm saying it right now and at the UN. Who is left behind? The widows are left behind. I don't understand, Carrie. I really don't understand. And I've just an hour ago been talking to our UK mission to the UN and my government equality office here about why, when this draft has got lots about older women, migrant women, HIV women, Indigenous women, older women, but absolutely nothing about widows. Why? Why?
And what
is there? I don't understand, because it's so important that these, and also I never want people to see widows exclusively as victims of all this terrible violence, because they are doing incredible social jobs and economic jobs. They're the sole parents of children. They're looking after maybe other dependents. They are wanting to be market women, agriculture, you know, they're working.
Yes, yes.
And the terrible thing, Carrie, can I just say this?
Absolutely.
On top of conflict, and there are many, many widows that are now in IDP and refugee camps. Yeah. The Rohingya, there's a whole widows camp of Rohingya, which also includes half widows, don't know what happened to their husbands. In Al-Hol in Syria, they're whatever they were and however they got to Syria, there are a whole lot of foreign widows of jihadists who are dead. But all of those, I feel, everyone is entitled to justice, whatever is alleged against them. There are all sorts of widows who are now in refugee camps. But also COVID-19, in the draft for the CSW, they're talking about the impact on women of COVID-19. But they don't mention the fact that because the pandemic is killing more men than women, it's also creating huge more numbers of widows of all ages. Right. And in the lockdown, and this is what we're hearing from our partners in Africa and in South Asia, in the lockdown, even the most exploitative and dangerous sorts of work that, or underpaid work that widows try to do to get food on the table, even domestic service or marketing, agricultural labor, begging, even prostitution, they can't go out. And there also a lot of widows' houses depended upon remittances from older sons who'd managed to migrate. Yeah. But they've lost their jobs because of the pandemic. So the remittances have dried up, so they are very poor.
You want a line on what the impact on widows has been in COVID? Now, is the UN responsive to that? Is there going to be a particular
Well,
line
I mean, that's what we keep trying to put in. And again, I've just come out of a meeting an hour ago asking our mission in the UK who was for it, because the African group actually agreed a whole lot of amendment to put all this in. And then it was all taken out.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think that there is this sort of resistance to having a particular attention to the issue around widows?
Well, I think there's a taboo, a great taboo about the talking and bringing out into the open and exposing the sort of practices which are enshrined in very patriarchal managements of all the religions. All religions, in a sense, they all start off in the same way, with this wonderful idea, the very word to bind people together and give them a code of ethics and morality. And yet they taken over by men. And so I think there's a taboo about even exposing the way that religion can, because this happens with Buddhists, Judaism, Catholicism, I mean, church, every religion, if you look at it, all these women are trying to, whether they're Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu, they're all trying to break this patriarchal way in which women are treated in almost all the world religions. So I think it's got something to do with that. There are, in many countries, great religious leaders in every religion who actually do see that this is not just a terrible injustice to women, but it's extremely damaging to the stability of a society.
I mean, you're talking about a sort of taboo about widowhood, but my mind went straight to King David and the psalmists, where there's this invocation to never neglect the widow and the orphan who is amongst you. Very, very strong theme of that right the way through. And so
here we've got the big theme now is women in decision making.
Yes.
And we really want to see widows, for example, in peace accords.
Well,
it's extraordinary.
They need to be explicitly nominated so they get represented.
Yeah, and we're trying to get the Security Council to have a national action plans which actually say, you can't have truth and reconciliation and peace unless you hear the survivors of these conflicts, who are the widows. So, but can I go back, Carrie? You just said something very interesting about I was talking about the taboo about talking about mourning and burial rights. So that's out, it never talked about in the whole work of violence against women. But for example, the African Charter of People's Rights, which has an annex on women's rights, and they've got Article 21 and 22 on property grabbing and chasing off. Chasing off is when you get just property grabbing, as you take everything she's got, even her pots and pans. But they would not, that's the African Union, they would not have anything about mourning and burial rights and the violence or stoning to death if you're a witch, or ritual cleansing by sex to exorcise the evil spirit, or all these things. They would not touch it. So I think there's a great reluctance to begin to open up that.
There's a big
because it shows then that governments are condoning violence.
Yes. I mean, this is why we always have to have these crucial conversations between, faith communities, cultural leaders, traditional leaders, and states. It needs to be an open conversation, because otherwise this sort of abuse carries on. And it's fantastic your pioneering and your championing of this, Margaret.
But I feel sometimes I have to admit, I've worked for 26, 27 years on this.
Yes.
And the violence is more than ever. And then we're living now. I mean, now you wonder about, is the UN in paralysis? What can the UN do? What can it do? All these conflicts that are going on. I mean, I have the enormous respect for the present Secretary General, Antonio Guterres,
Yes,
who actually pleaded for a universal ceasefire whilst we all come together to tackle the pandemic.
Yes.
And it fell upon deaf ears. And more countries are using the under cover of COVID are carrying on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Conflict under the cover of COVID. So look, Margaret, I mean, I don't think it's just the UN that can feel a little bit paralyzed in the face of all this. I think individuals coming in and listening to our conversation, and they'll be applauding, you know, your tireless effort to raise the issue and the challenge of what happens for people who move into widowhood through no choice of their own, right? That's an interesting thing. Widowhood is not a choice. It comes at you. And then you're really at the mercy of how your community responds to that, how your society responds to that. I think people listening may ask, well, yes, but Margaret, I think this is appalling, but what can I do? How can I find out more? And I'm saying, read the book.
We really want so that widows can have a voice.
Yes.
And their voices can be heard.
Absolutely.
And that actually, and we talk about that all the time. And how can we get that funding and capacity building? Not lots of money. They can't deal with $1 million from from the UN because they can't do all that monitoring. They want little bits of training and money and sharing best practices. I mean, we took a whole lot of Afghan widows. I mean, Afghanistan now. And there are just so many widows begging on the streets of Kabul and everywhere. You can imagine what happens to widows in Afghanistan. But actually, we organized through CARE, and some of the widows went to Nepal because that's my very best widows association. And when the big war finished with the Maoists and they actually had a new election, they got 41 women into parliament and 11 of those were widows.
Wow.
So you really want widows in all the decision-making thing. Yes. But, and then, I mean, also, Carrie, what is so terrible now, and that is a post-Brexit thing as well for us, is whole investment in war and the manufacture of weapons. And this is my country, the UK. It's desperate to trade, desperate to sell arms. So human rights, remember Robin Cook, who said, put human rights into our foreign policy. I'm afraid that's gone. And with Brexit now, we are desperate. And we are silent, even in the evidence of terrible things that are going on. And widows and women generally who are now being targeted, women rights defenders, women activists. So it's really, really a dangerous time for women. And we've just had International Women's Day on March the 8th. And everyone was saying to celebrate. And I'm afraid I thought, but what are we celebrating? We're celebrating the efforts, but surely we are deploring the real lack of real action to actually ensure that all women are safe and that they are. And I've been a lot in an incredible part of Syria called Rojava, but it's the autonomous administration of northeast Syria under the Kurds. And there they've got a leader called Abdullah Öcalan, who's been in prison, solitary confinement now for over 20 years. But he's the only leader, male leader, I think, in the history of the world, who has said outright, you can have no democracy, no just and free society, unless you have women's empowerment and gender equality absolutely central. So there they've got extraordinary goings on with every organization, institution, decision-making body always has co-chairs, co-presidents. And I think that would be an absolutely wonderful thing if we had the Security Council, the International Criminal Court, all our institutions, all our ministries. You always had not a man, but a man and a woman together, because we're not, you know, we need men on our side. And as Mary Robinson said, in every country there are serious men who also are on our side and actually also would support us. So we've got to all come together. And what worries me in the whole CSW coming up beginning next week, we mustn't be in competition with each other. I want Indigenous, disabled, HIV, migrant, older, younger women all to have their rights. But if there's to be a list of that on the categories of subsects of women, then I think that widows should be there, because there are more widows now in the world than all those, each one of those subsets, because every hour, Carrie, as I speak, there are widows being made, new widows, because of conflicts, terrorism, natural disasters, and now the pandemic. So I hope that by, people listening to you, talking to me, will support and go into our website, visit and begin to talk about it much more, and not see widows as just poor, passive people who need help, but see and respect their resilience and their courage as they look after their children. Absolutely. And try to survive. I think the point is actually that not that people think of widows in a pity the widow. I think the point is that widows are disappeared. I think they're just disappeared from our categories of thinking. And thank you so much, Margaret. I'm delighted that you rescued out of your very, very busy day talking to the UN and Security Council and the UK government to spend time with us, to elaborate on the issue around widowhood. So thank you so much, Margaret. It's been well. Thank you for giving me your time, because I know how busy you are and what a wonderful job you do. Thank you very, very much, Carrie.